She was abandoned at the airport by her husband. 12 years later, he begged for help and was paralyzed to learn she was the only one who could save him. When Sarah Thompson drove her husband to Bradley International Airport that cold December morning, she thought she was just helping him catch a business flight. She could never have imagined that moment would shatter her world, and later rebuild it in ways she never expected. This is not just another story of betrayal. It's a powerful tale of how life's cruelest moments can lead to our greatest purpose, and how true justice comes in the most unexpected ways. 12 years later, in the very same airport, destiny would write an ending that no one could have predicted. Get ready for a journey that will make you believe in second chances, the power of resilience, and the perfect timing of karma. This is Sarah's story, and it might just change the way you think about life's greatest setbacks. Sarah Thompson stood in her kitchen in Millbrook, Connecticut, carefully arranging the table for her 35th wedding anniversary dinner. At 62, she still took pride in making every celebration special. The china plates that Richard had given her on their 20th anniversary sparkled under the soft lighting, and the aroma of his favorite pot roast filled their colonial-style home. Picking up a framed photo from the counter, Sarah smiled at the memory of their wedding day. Richard had been so handsome in his tuxedo, and she remembered how he'd promised to love her forever. 3 beautiful children, and 35 years later, she still felt blessed, even though things weren't quite the same lately. As she adjusted the flower centerpiece, Richard's cell phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Sarah glanced at it, surprised to see a text message preview from Jessica, his new assistant. "Can't wait to see you, Tom." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she set down the flowers. Richard had been mentioning Jessica's name more frequently over the past few months. "She's so efficient," he'd say, or "Jessica handled that client situation perfectly." Something about the way he said her name made Sarah's stomach tighten. The front door opened, and Richard walked in, looking sharp in his expensive suit. At 65, he still turned heads with his silver hair and confident stride. "Something smells wonderful," he said, quickly picking up his phone from the counter and sliding it into his pocket. "Happy anniversary, darling," Sarah said, reaching up to kiss him. He turned slightly, and her lips caught his cheek instead of his mouth. Another small change she'd been noticing lately. During dinner, Richard seemed distracted, checking his phone under the table. "The Stevens account," he explained, though Sarah hadn't asked. "Big merger coming up." "Remember our first apartment?" Sarah asked, trying to recapture the warmth of their earlier years. "That tiny place above the bookstore?" "Oh, yes," Richard replied, wincing slightly and rubbing his chest. "Are you all right?" Sarah's concern was immediate. "Just heartburn," he said, but his face had gone pale. "Actually, I've been having these pains more often lately." Their oldest son Michael called during dessert, wishing them happy anniversary. Sarah noticed how Richard kept his answer short, seeming eager to end the call. The Richard she'd married would have chatted with their son for ages. Later that evening, while Richard was in the shower, Sarah hung up his suit jacket. A small receipt fluttered to the floor, from Preston's Jewelers downtown. Her heart skipped a beat. Richard hadn't mentioned buying any jewelry, and her birthday wasn't for months. The next day, Sarah attended the annual hospital benefit lunch, where Richard's firm was a major donor. As she walked toward their usual table, she spotted him near the bar with a striking woman in her late 30s. The woman laughed at something Richard said, touching his arm with casual familiarity. Her name tag read, Jessica Miller. Sarah's world tilted slightly. So this was Jessica, the efficient assistant, the perfect problem solver, the woman whose text messages kept making her husband's phone buzz during their anniversary dinner. Before Sarah could approach them, Richard grabbed his chest, his face contorting in pain. This time it wasn't just heartburn. As he collapsed against the bar, Jessica stepped back, looking helplessly at the crowd. It was Sarah who rushed forward, Sarah who caught him, Sarah who called for help. In the chaos that followed, Sarah noticed 2 things: how Jessica disappeared as soon as the paramedics arrived, and how Michael, who had surprised them by attending the benefit, watched the whole scene with a troubled expression. Later that night, alone in their bedroom while Richard slept downstairs in his recliner as the doctor had suggested. Sarah found herself looking at old photos, the happy couple on their wedding day, family vacations, 3 children growing up, 35 years of memories. "When did we start changing?" she whispered to the smiling faces in the photos. But deep down, she knew. She just wasn't ready to admit it yet. She didn't know it then, but this anniversary would be their last. And the receipt from Preston's jewelers, still tucked in Richard's jacket pocket, would soon become evidence of how thoroughly a person could deceive someone who loved them completely. The emergency room buzzed with activity as Sarah sat next to Richard's bed, watching the heart monitor. The doctor's words still echoed in her head. Severe coronary blockage, immediate surgery needed, significant risks at his age. "Nan?" Amanda, their middle child, rushed in. At 32, she looked so much like Sarah at that age. "How's Dad?" "The doctor says he needs bypass surgery," Sarah explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "They want to operate next week." Richard stirred, opening his eyes. "Where's my phone? I need to call the office." "Jessica's handling everything," Amanda said, her tone oddly flat. "She's been calling every hour." Sarah noticed how Richard relaxed at the mention of Jessica's name, another piece of a puzzle she didn't want to complete. The next morning, Sarah met with the cardiac surgeon. The news wasn't good. Their insurance would only cover part of the procedure. They needed $175,000, and soon. "I'll sell Mom's house," Sarah told Michael over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. "Mom, no, that's your safety net," Michael protested. "Let Dad's firm handle it. They're having financial troubles, Richard told me last month." Sarah didn't mention the suspicious bank transfers she'd noticed recently. As Sarah left the cafeteria, she almost collided with Jessica, who was carrying a stack of folders. "Oh, Mrs. Thompson. I brought Richard's work documents." "The doctor said no work," Sarah replied firmly. "But he insisted," Jessica said, brushing past her toward Richard's room. Later that afternoon, Sarah's friend Carol from the library gathered their prayer group. "We're here for you, Sarah," Carol said, squeezing her hand. But something in her friend's eyes suggested she knew more than she was saying. At the bank, Sarah signed the papers to sell her mother's house. The teller's sympathetic look made her uncomfortable. Such a devoted wife? She heard the woman whisper to her colleague. Amanda confronted her that evening in the hospital parking lot. "Mom, did you check Dad's business accounts? Something's not right." "Amanda, please, your father needs this surgery. And you're just going to sacrifice everything? Again?" Amanda's words stung with untruth Sarah wasn't ready to face. Back in Richard's room, Sarah found him speaking quietly on his phone. He hung up quickly when she entered. "Jessica?" she asked. "She's handling a crisis at work," he said, not meeting her eyes. The next few days passed in a blur of medical consultations and paperwork. Sarah noticed how Richard insisted that only Jessica bring his work documents, how he whispered on the phone when he thought Sarah was sleeping in the hospital chair. During one of her brief trips home, Sarah joined her library's book club meeting. They were discussing digital audiobooks, but Sarah could barely focus. The older patrons kept asking about Richard, telling her how lucky he was to have such a dedicated wife. Brian, their youngest, called from Seattle. "Mom, are you sure about selling Grandma's house?" "Your father needs me, Brian." The words felt rehearsed now. A week before the surgery, Sarah overheard 2 nurses talking. "That's the one with the younger assistant always visiting," one whispered. "Poor wife has no idea." But Sarah was beginning to understand. She just couldn't face it yet, not with Richard's life hanging in the balance. The house sale would be final tomorrow. The surgery was scheduled for next week. She had to focus on that. That night, as she arranged Richard's medications, she found a crumpled note in his robe pocket. "Everything's ready for after your recovery." Sarah placed the note back exactly as she'd found it. Tomorrow, she would sell her mother's house to save her husband's life. She just prayed she wasn't also funding his escape plan. 6 months after the surgery, Sarah's life revolved around Richard's recovery schedule. Every morning, she checked his blood pressure, organized his medications, and prepared his heart-healthy breakfast before heading to her shift at the library. "You're an angel," Richard would say, but his eyes kept drifting to his phone. One Thursday afternoon, Sarah went to Preston's jewelers to pick up Richard's watch after repairs. As she approached the counter, she heard a familiar laugh. Jessica stood at the display case, trying on what looked like an engagement ring. "Mrs. Thompson?" Jessica's hand dropped to her side. "I'm just shopping for my sister." The jeweler's confused expression told a different story. "Will you be paying for this with the same card as Mr. Thompson's previous purchase, miss?" Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "I just came for my husband's watch," she managed to say. Back at the library, Carol caught Sarah crying in the biography section. "Honey, I've been trying to tell you for months. Everyone at First Federal Bank sees the transfers he's making." "He's just moving money for his recovery," Sarah insisted, but her voice shook. That evening, their youngest son Brian called unexpectedly. "Mom, I heard Dad on the phone when I called his office. He was talking about San Diego." "He has clients there," Sarah said automatically. "Mom, he was talking about houses." The next morning at the hospital's follow-up appointment, Richard's doctor praised his recovery. "He's doing remarkably well, Mrs. Thompson. Your dedication made all the difference." Richard squeezed Sarah's hand during the appointment, but she noticed how quickly he checked his phone afterward. At the library, more bad news waited. The director called a staff meeting. "Budget cuts are coming," he announced. "We'll need to reduce programs and possibly staff." Sarah's hands trembled as she shelved books later that day. Without her mother's house as backup, losing her job would be devastating. She overheard two patrons whispering, "That's the one whose husband's having an affair with his assistant. Everyone knows except her." That night, Brian called again. "Mom, I heard Dad fighting with someone on the phone. He thought I'd hung up. He kept saying, 'Jessica, you have to wait. The timing isn't right.'" Sarah's world tilted. The jewelry, the phone calls, the money transfers, the house hunting in San Diego. All the pieces were there, but acknowledging them meant accepting that the last 6 months of devotion had been a lie. "Sarah?" Carol appeared at her door that evening. "The bank tellers told me Richard's been moving large sums to a new account in Jessica's name. He needs it for his recovery," Sarah repeated her mantra. "Sarah, he's recovered. The doctor said so today." The next morning, Richard announced he had a business trip planned. "Just a quick flight to meet clients," he said, kissing her cheek. Sarah found the flight confirmation email open on his laptop. 2 tickets to San Diego. She called Amanda, who worked in real estate. "Can you check property records in San Diego?" The silence on the other end spoke volumes. Finally, Amanda said, "Dad and Jessica closed on a house there last week." That night, Richard was unusually attentive, almost like his old self. "You saved my life," he said over dinner. "I'll never forget that." The words felt like a goodbye. Later, Sarah found a note in Richard's study. "Everything's set for next week. Can't wait to start our new life. Love, Jay." The carefully constructed facade was crumbling. 6 months of caring for a man who was planning to leave. 6 months of devotion answered with betrayal. Tomorrow, Richard would ask her to drive him to the airport for his business trip. Sarah sat in their bedroom, holding the note, finally facing the truth she'd been avoiding. The heart she'd helped heal was about to break hers. The December morning felt unusually cold as Sarah drove Richard to Bradley International Airport. The digital clock on the dashboard read 9:15 a.m. Richard kept checking his phone, his knee bouncing nervously. "Which gate is your flight?" Sarah asked. "Let's go to the main terminal first. I need to talk to you about something." Richard's voice had an edge she'd never heard before. The parking garage was crowded with holiday travelers. Sarah noticed Richard scanning the area as they walked toward the terminal entrance. She thought about the note she'd found, about Jessica, about the house in San Diego. Still, she followed him inside. They stopped near the departure board. Richard checked his phone again, then turned to face her. "Sarah, I have something for you." He pulled out a thick envelope from his briefcase. Around them, travelers rushed past with their luggage. A family laughed nearby. A baby cried somewhere in the crowd. Sarah's world narrowed to that white envelope. "What is this?" Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Divorce papers." Richard's words cut through the airport noise, and a letter explaining everything. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the envelope. The first page was indeed a divorce petition. Behind it, a letter began. "Dear Sarah, by the time you read this, Jessica and I will be on our way to our new life in San Diego." "Richard?" Her voice trembled. Papers slipped from her hands, scattering across the terminal floor. "I can't live this lie anymore," Richard announced, loud enough for nearby travelers to turn and stare. "Jessica's waiting for me. You served your purpose, took care of me during my recovery. Now it's time for me to live my real life." Sarah felt her legs weaken. "The house? The surgery? Our 35 years. The money's gone, Sarah. I transferred everything to new accounts last week. You can keep your library job." He glanced at his watch. Jessica's waiting at Gate B. A young flight attendant noticed Sarah swaying and rushed to support her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Other travelers stopped to watch. Some began picking up the scattered divorce papers. Sarah saw their faces shift from curiosity to sympathy as they realized what was happening. "You'll get the formal paperwork from my lawyer," Richard continued, already backing away. "Don't try to fight it. It's over." "Richard, please." Sarah reached for him, still wearing the heart-shaped pin he'd given her last Christmas. "We can talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about. You're 62, Sarah. I've got a chance at a new life with someone who makes me feel young again. Thank you for taking care of me all these years, especially during my surgery. But now it's time for my happiness." Michael appeared suddenly, pushing through the crowd. He'd been tracking his father's phone, suspecting something like this might happen. "How dare you?" he shouted at Richard. "After everything she did for you." But Richard was already walking away, rolling his suitcase toward Gate B, where Jessica waited in a red coat, waving. Sarah collapsed into a nearby chair, surrounded by strangers offering tissues and water. The flight attendant stayed beside her while Michael called Amanda and Brian. "Security to Gate B," someone announced over the intercom. Sarah looked up to see Michael confronting Jessica, who quickly ducked behind airport security. Through the terminal windows, Sarah watched Richard's plane take off, carrying with it 35 years of what she now knew had been lies. Her phone buzzed, a notification from their joint account, balance $172.54. Hours later, Michael drove his mother home. The house felt emptier than it ever had. On the kitchen counter, Sarah found one last note. "I forwarded all my mail to our new address. The house goes on the market next week. My lawyer will contact you." Sarah sat in her kitchen, surrounded by photos of a life that no longer existed. The heart-shaped pin felt heavy on her sweater. She removed it slowly, placing it in a drawer filled with other memories that would never be the same. That night, as snow began to fall outside her window, Sarah Thompson faced her first evening as a woman abandoned. But she didn't know that 12 years from this dark moment, she would stand in that same airport terminal, a completely different person, while Richard Ferguson faced the consequences of his choices. The first month after the airport, Sarah barely left her bed. Empty coffee cups and untouched meals cluttered her nightstand. Friends from her prayer group called daily, but she let their calls go to voicemail. "Mom, you need to eat," Michael said, bringing groceries every few days. The house she'd lived in for 30 years was already on the market. Richard's lawyer had made sure of that. Sarah spent hours scrolling through rental listings on her phone. Everything in Millbrook was too expensive on a librarian's salary. Finally, she found a small one-bedroom apartment above the hardware store downtown. "You can't live there," Amanda said when she came to help pack. "It's tiny. This is all your fault anyway. How did you not see the signs?" Sarah folded another sweater into a box. "Amanda, please." "No, Mom. You were so busy being the perfect wife, you missed everything. The late meetings, the secret phone calls, the money transfers. Everyone knew except you." The prayer group from the library helped Sarah move. As they carried boxes up the narrow stairs to her new apartment, Carol pulled her aside. "Sarah, the library board is meeting next week. There's talk of major budget cuts." Sarah nodded numbly. One more piece of her life threatening to crumble. That evening, Mrs. Peterson, an elderly library patron, called Sarah in tears. "I lost everything," she sobbed. "This nice young man online said he was from the bank. He helped me fix my computer, and then all my savings are gone." Sarah listened to Mrs. Peterson's story, something stirring in her mind. How many other seniors were falling victim to online scams? How many needed help understanding technology? The next morning, Sarah forced herself to shower and go to work. In the library's computer section, she watched elderly patrons struggling with basic online tasks. One gentleman couldn't figure out how to video chat with his grandchildren. Another couldn't access his online banking. "Mrs. Thompson?" A regular patron approached her desk. "Could you help me set up my new tablet? My children bought it for Christmas, but I can't figure it out." During her lunch break, Sarah noticed an email from Richard's lawyer. The divorce was moving forward, and the house sale was almost complete. She deleted it without responding. Brian called that evening. "Mom, Dad wants to know if I can visit them in San Diego next month." "Them?" The word felt like a knife. "I'm sorry, Mom. He's still my father." Sarah sat in her small apartment that night, surrounded by boxes she hadn't unpacked. On her laptop, she scrolled through more stories of elderly people losing their savings to online scams. Something needed to change. The next morning at the library staff meeting, the director announced potential program cuts. Sarah raised her hand. "What if we started something new, a digital literacy program for seniors?" Her colleagues looked skeptical, but Carol spoke up. "We could prevent situations like Mrs. Peterson's." That afternoon, Sarah's prayer group gathered in the library's community room. "We're here for you," they assured her. One member brought information about a support group for divorced women. Another offered to help develop computer lessons. As Sarah walked home that evening, Amanda called again. "Mom, I'm sorry about what I said. I was angry. Dad's the one who should have seen what he was losing." Sarah looked up at her small apartment window. The life she'd known was gone, but maybe, just maybe, something new could grow from these ashes. That night, she opened her laptop and began typing. "Digital literacy for seniors, a proposal for community education." Her hands shook, but her mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. On her dresser, a framed photo lay face down, her and Richard on their last anniversary. Sarah picked it up, removed the photo, and replaced it with the library's mission statement, empowering our community through knowledge. Tomorrow, she would present her proposal to the library board. She didn't know it yet, but this was the first step toward a future bigger than anything she could imagine. Sarah stood before the library board, clutching her proposal. Last month, Mrs. Peterson lost her life savings to an online scam. She's not alone. Our seniors need help navigating the digital world. To her surprise, the board approved a 3-month trial program. Sarah spent her evenings developing simple lessons on email, online banking safety, and video calling. "We need a volunteer with tech experience," Carol said during their planning session. "These seniors will need lots of one-on-one help." That's when James Anderson walked into the library. Recently retired from teaching computer science at the local college, he was looking for volunteer opportunities. "I saw your flyer about the digital literacy program," he said. His gentle manner immediately put Sarah at ease. "I'd like to help." The first class had 12 seniors. Sarah taught them how to create strong passwords, while James helped them set up email accounts. Mrs. Peterson sat in the front row, determined to learn from her experience. "My grandchildren can't believe I'm sending emails," one elderly man announced proudly after the 3rd session. "They actually respond to my messages now." Word spread quickly through the senior community. The class size doubled, then tripled. Sarah and James developed a waiting list. One morning, an elderly woman rushed into the library. "Someone tried to scam me," she announced triumphantly. "But I remembered what you taught us about suspicious emails. I didn't click anything." The local senior center asked Sarah to bring the program to their facility. Then the community center called. James volunteered more hours, and they developed advanced classes for their first graduates. "Mom, this is amazing," Michael said, attending one of the sessions. "These people adore you." Even Amanda noticed the change in her mother. "You seem different," she said over coffee. "Stronger." Sarah was different. Each senior who mastered a new skill, each scam prevented, each family reconnected through video calls, it all helped heal something inside her. James became a constant presence, arriving early to help set up and staying late to answer questions. His patience with the seniors matched Sarah's, and she found herself looking forward to their planning sessions. "Would you like to grab coffee sometime?" he asked one evening. "To discuss the program, of course." Sarah hesitated. It had been 8 months since the airport. "Just coffee," she agreed. That weekend, their coffee meeting lasted 3 hours. They talked about the program but also about books, travel, and their shared love of teaching. James mentioned he was also divorced, years ago. The next day, Carol cornered Sarah in the library. "I saw you with James at the coffee shop. He couldn't take his eyes off you." "We were discussing the program," Sarah protested, but she felt herself blushing. That afternoon, a letter arrived from Richard's lawyer. The divorce was final. Sarah expected pain, but instead felt oddly peaceful. During that evening's class, an elderly man brought in a tablet. "My son got this for me last Christmas. I was afraid to use it. Now I video chat with my grandkids every Sunday." James helped the man set up his tablet, then turned to Sarah. "We're changing lives here." The local newspaper ran a story about the program. "Local library fights elder fraud through education," the headline read. Sarah's phone started ringing with calls from other libraries wanting to start similar programs. "We need more volunteers," Sarah told James over their now regular coffee meetings. "And a better curriculum." "I might know some other retired teachers," he replied, his hand briefly touching hers on the table. That evening, Sarah looked around her small apartment. The moving boxes were finally unpacked. New curtains brightened the windows. On her desk, a folder held the program's success stories. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "Dad and Jessica got married." Sarah looked at the message, surprised to feel nothing but detachment. She was too busy planning tomorrow's lesson on video calling to dwell on the past. A new email popped up. Grandma finally figured out Facebook. An excited granddaughter wrote to thank Sarah. These messages meant more than any jewelry Richard had ever given her. The digital clock on her desk showed 9:15 p.m., exactly 1 year since that morning at the airport. Sarah smiled, realizing she hadn't thought about that day in weeks. She had more important things to focus on now. 3 libraries in neighboring towns adopted Sarah's digital literacy program. Every week, she received calls from senior centers and community groups wanting to learn more. "The Hartford Times wants to interview you," Carol announced one morning, waving the phone message. "They're doing a story on elder fraud prevention." The reporter spent a full day observing Sarah's classes. She watched as seniors learned to spot fake emails and secure their accounts. The story ran on the front page of the local section. "Library program saves seniors from scammers." James brought coffee to celebrate the article. Their morning planning sessions had become longer, more personal. Sarah found herself sharing stories about her life, laughing at his jokes, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel again. "Mom's got a boyfriend," Amanda teased during their weekly lunch. "Michael said he saw you two at the diner." "James is just a colleague," Sarah insisted, but her daughter noticed the smile she couldn't hide. The phone call from Brian changed everything. "Mom, I visited Dad and Jessica in San Diego," he said. "They want me to move there. Dad's offering me a job." Sarah gripped the phone tighter. "What did you tell them?" "I'm considering it. Dad seems really happy with his new life." That evening's class was a blur. James noticed her distraction and took over the lesson. After the seniors left, he touched her shoulder. "Want to talk about it?" Over dinner at the local diner, Sarah told him about Brian's call. "I feel like I'm losing my son." "You're not losing him," James said. "He's just trying to navigate a difficult situation." The next morning, Sarah received an email that made her blood run cold. Jessica wanted to connect and clear the air. "Delete it," Carol advised. "She probably feels guilty now that she's married to him." Sarah's finger hovered over the delete button when another email arrived from her bank. Her account was overdrawn. The program's recent expansion had stretched her resources thin. That afternoon, during a lesson on password security, an elderly woman raised her hand. "My daughter says this class saved my savings. Last week, I recognized a scam email right away." The woman's words reminded Sarah why she'd started this journey. She opened her laptop and began writing a grant proposal for program funding. James stayed late to help. "We could reach more seniors with proper funding," he said. Their hands touched as they both reached for the same document. The local news station aired a segment about the program. Phone calls poured in. Other libraries wanted training. Senior centers requested workshops. "We need to think bigger," James said during their morning coffee. His hand found hers across the table, and this time she didn't pull away. Amanda called that evening. Mom, I'm sorry about how I acted after everything. Watching you build this program, seeing you happy again. I was wrong about you not seeing the signs. You were just choosing to believe in someone you loved. Sarah sat in her apartment that night, surrounded by thank you notes from seniors and their families. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brian. Not taking Dad's offer. My life is here. A knock at the door revealed James holding 2 coffee cups. Thought you might need this? Working late on the grant proposal? Come in, Sarah said. As they worked together at her small kitchen table, she realized something. Her apartment no longer felt small. Her life no longer felt empty. The next morning, Sarah received an unexpected call. A major senior advocacy group wanted to feature her program in their national newsletter. This could go nationwide, Carol exclaimed. Later that day, James surprised her with theater tickets. Time for a real date, he said. No grant writing, no lesson plans, just us. Sarah looked at her reflection in the library window. The woman who had collapsed in tears at the airport was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had built something meaningful from her pain. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Brian. Dad's business isn't doing well. Jessica's not happy. Sarah put the phone away. She had a date to prepare for, a grant to finish, and a future to build. That evening, as James held her hand in the theater, Sarah realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well. The email from the National Digital Education Conference arrived on a Tuesday morning. We would be honored to have you present your senior digital literacy program at our annual conference in San Diego this December. Sarah stared at her screen, her hand trembling slightly. San Diego. Richard's city. You have to go, James said when she showed him the email. This could take the program national. Sarah hadn't been on a plane since that day at Bradley Airport 2 years ago. The thought of flying made her stomach clench. I'll go with you, James offered, squeezing her hand. You don't have to do this alone. That evening, Brian called with news. Dad's investment firm is in trouble. Some clients are suing him and Jessica for mismanaging their retirement funds. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked. Because they live in San Diego, Mom. If you're going to that conference, you should know. Sarah spent the night tossing and turning. The next morning, while preparing for her senior class, she received an email that made her blood run cold. Dear Mrs. Thompson, Jessica wrote, I heard about your conference presentation. Richard and I will make sure your program doesn't overshadow our new senior financial advisory service. Consider this a warning. Carol found Sarah staring at the computer. Delete it, she said firmly. They're desperate. I heard their firm is losing clients daily. The conference organizers called to finalize details. Sarah would present to over 500 people. They wanted to feature her program in their main hall. Mom, this is huge, Michael said when she told him. Don't let them stop you. Sarah threw herself into preparation, but her nerves grew worse. During one class, her hands shook so badly she could barely type. James noticed. After class, he took her to dinner. Talk to me, he said. What's really scaring you? What if I see them? Sarah whispered. What if I fall apart again? You're not the same woman they hurt, James reminded her. You've built something important. The local paper ran another story about the program. That afternoon, Sarah received an angry email from Richard. Jessica's senior financial service was my idea first. You're stealing my concept. Sarah showed the email to James. Should I be worried? They can't stop you from helping people, he said. Besides, your program is about education, not managing money. As the conference drew closer, support poured in. Her senior students organized a fundraiser for her travel expenses. The library board approved time off. Carol arranged extra volunteers. We're all behind you, Amanda said, helping Sarah shop for professional clothes. Show them what you've built. The night before booking her flight, Sarah's phone rang. It was Brian. Mom, there's something you should know. Dad and Jessica. Their marriage is falling apart. She's been seen with some tech millionaire. Sarah sat in her apartment. Looking at old photos. The woman in them seemed like a stranger now. Someone who had defined herself by a man's love. James came over with coffee and conference materials. I booked my ticket, he said. I'll be in the front row when you present. Sarah finally booked her flight, choosing a seat by the window. As she clicked confirm, her hands were steady. The next morning, her senior class surprised her with a good luck card. "You saved my retirement," Mrs. Movufmal Peterson had written. "Go show San Diego what you've created." Carol rushed in with news. "Your program just got mentioned on a national senior advocacy website. The conference hall might be too small." That evening, Sarah stood at her window watching the sunset. 2 years ago, she'd been broken in an airport terminal. Now she was heading to San Diego, not as Richard's wife, but as a keynote speaker. Her phone buzzed. Another threatening email from Jessica. Sarah deleted it without reading it. She had a presentation to finish. James called to say goodnight. "1 week until San Diego," he said. "Ready to show them what you're made of?" Sarah looked at her conference notes, at the success stories from her students, at the photo of her smiling with her senior class. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." Sarah stood in Bradley International Airport, staring at the departure board. Same terminal, same time, 12 years later. James squeezed her hand. "Your flight to San Diego is on time," he said. "Sure you don't want me to take an earlier flight?" "No, you finished the volunteer training. I'll be fine." Sarah's voice was stronger than she'd expected. As James left for work, Michael appeared. "Thought you could use company while you wait." Sarah checked her carry-on bag one last time. Presentation materials, laptop, conference schedule. A commotion near the security line caught her attention. "Sir, you need a valid ticket to enter," a TSA agent was saying. "Please, I just need to get back to San Diego." A man in rumpled clothes pleaded. "My bank accounts are frozen. I can pay when I get there." Sarah froze. She knew that voice. Richard Ferguson looked nothing like the man who'd abandoned her here 12 years ago. His expensive suits were replaced by worn clothing. His confident stance was gone. "My wife left me for someone else," Richard was telling the agent. "I just need to get home." Sarah watched as security escorted him away from the checkpoint. He turned, and their eyes met across the terminal. Time stopped. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His legs began to shake, and he grabbed a nearby column for support. Michael stepped forward protectively. Reporters from the local news station approached Sarah, cameras rolling. "Mrs. Thompson, can you tell us about your keynote speech at the National Digital Education Conference?" Richard stood paralyzed, watching as reporters surrounded his ex-wife. "Your program has prevented millions in senior fraud losses," one reporter said. "How does it feel to be a national leader in elder protection?" Sarah answered questions with calm confidence, aware of Richard's stunned presence just feet away. "Mrs. Thompson, is it true the federal government is considering funding your program nationwide?" Michael stepped into view of the cameras. "My mother's program started right here in Connecticut. Now it's helping seniors across the country protect their retirement savings from scammers and fraudulent investment schemes." Richard flinched at the word fraudulent. The airline announced boarding for the San Diego flight. As Sarah gathered her things, Richard finally found his voice. "Sarah?" He sounded old, broken. She turned to face him. The terminal seemed to quiet. I lost everything," Richard stammered. "Jessica left me for a tech entrepreneur. The investment firm collapsed. They froze our accounts during the fraud investigation." Sarah looked at this man she'd once loved, seeing him clearly for the first time. "I'm sorry to hear that, Richard. Could you help me get a ticket home?" His voice cracked. "I have nothing left." Michael stepped between them. "After what you did to her?" "It's okay, Michael." Sarah's voice was gentle. She turned to Richard. "There's a senior assistance office downtown. They help people who've been victims of financial fraud. You might want to visit them." Richard's legs trembled harder. You're really speaking at a national conference?" "Keynote speaker," Michael said proudly. "Mom's program is revolutionizing senior digital education." The final boarding call echoed through the terminal. Sarah picked up her bag. "I have to go," she said. "My audience is waiting." Richard watched, still clutching the column, as Sarah walked confidently toward the gate. She never looked back. On the plane, Sarah took her window seat. Below, she could see the spot where she'd collapsed 12 years ago. Now, from this height, it seemed so small. Her phone buzzed with a message from James. "See you in San Diego. So proud of you." As the plane took off, Sarah thought about the woman she'd been, crying on this terminal floor. That woman could never have imagined this moment, flying to San Diego not as a victim, but but as a victor. Richard remained by the column, watching her plane disappear into the clouds, still shaking from the encounter. He pulled out a crumpled flyer from his pocket, one advertising Sarah's program for seniors affected by financial fraud. Sometimes, Sarah realized, as Connecticut disappeared below her, justice arrives in ways you never expect. The San Diego Convention Center buzzed with activity. Sarah stood backstage, reviewing her presentation notes. The main hall was packed with over 500 attendees. 5 minutes until your keynote, the conference coordinator announced. Sarah's phone lit up with a message from Carol. The whole library is streaming your speech. The introduction began. Our keynote speakers program has prevented over $2 million in senior fraud losses across 3 states. Please welcome Sarah Thompson. As Sarah walked onto the stage, she spotted a familiar face in the back row. Jessica sat there, no longer looking like the polished assistant who had stolen her husband. Her designer clothes were replaced by a simple dress, her confident smile gone. Thank you, Sarah began. 12 years ago, I learned firsthand how quickly someone can lose everything they've worked for. The audience leaned forward as Sarah shared her story, transforming personal pain into purpose. She explained how one elderly patron's near miss with online fraud had inspired her program. Today, over 50 libraries have adopted our curriculum, Sarah continued. Last month alone, we helped prevent 300 seniors from falling victim to online scams. In the middle of her presentation, movement near the door caught her attention. Richard slipped into the hall, looking even more disheveled than he had at the airport. He took a seat next to Jessica, who immediately moved away. Sarah didn't miss a beat. Our latest initiative focuses on protecting retirement savings from fraudulent investment schemes. She clicked to the next slide showing statistics on senior financial fraud. Richard and Jessica squirmed in their seats. Mrs. Thompson, a reporter called during the Q&A, is it true the federal government is considering implementing your program nationwide? Before Sarah could answer, Jessica stood up. This program was Richard's idea. He told me about it years ago. The room fell silent. Sarah remained calm. Would you like to explain that to the FBI agents investigating your investment firm? Jessica's face went pale. She grabbed her purse and rushed toward the exit, nearly colliding with James as he entered the hall. Speaking of success stories, Sarah continued smoothly, I'd like to acknowledge our lead volunteer instructor, James Anderson. His dedication has been crucial to our program's growth. The audience applauded as James took his seat in the front row. During the standing ovation that followed her speech, Sarah watched Richard attempt to approach Jessica near the exit. Jessica brushed past him without a word, leaving him standing alone. Conference attendees swarmed Sarah afterward, requesting program materials and implementation guides. Library directors from across the country wanted to schedule training sessions. The Department of Health and Human Services representative wants to meet with you, the conference coordinator whispered. They're interested in funding a national rollout. Richard hovered at the edge of the crowd, watching as his ex-wife was surrounded by admirers and reporters. The confident businessman who had once dismissed her as just a librarian was gone. James appeared at Sarah's side with water and a proud smile. Ready for your meeting with the Federal Grant Committee? Sarah? Richard's voice cracked as he finally approached. I need help. The FBI is investigating our firm. Jessica's been working with their lawyers. Sarah looked at the man she'd once built her life around. The senior assistant's office I mentioned handles cases like yours. You don't understand. Richard pleaded. I'm 65. I've lost everything. My accounts are frozen. Jessica. She set me up to take the fall. Before Sarah could respond, the conference director approached. Mrs. Thompson, the federal funding panel is ready for you. Sarah gathered her materials, then turned to Richard one last time. There's a beginner's computer class at the San Diego Public Library on Tuesdays. You might want to start there. As she walked away with James, Sarah heard Richard call after her. I'm sorry. I was wrong about you. But Sarah didn't look back. She had a federal grant meeting to attend, a program to expand, and a future to build. That evening, during the conference gala, James led Sarah onto the dance floor. Proud of you, he whispered. Sarah smiled, remembering how she'd once thought her life was over. Instead, it was just beginning. Her phone buzzed with messages from Michael, Amanda, and Brian. "You crushed it, Mom. We watched the live stream. You're trending on social media." Sarah Thompson, keynote speaker and program director, danced with the man who had helped her rebuild her life, while somewhere in San Diego, Richard Ferguson faced the consequences of destroying his. The morning after the conference, Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News had broken about Jessica's arrest at San Diego International Airport while attempting to flee the country. Federal agents were waiting at the gate, Michael told her. They found offshore accounts in her name. Dad's firm lost millions of seniors' retirement savings. Sarah sat in her hotel room, watching the story unfold on the local news. Jessica's perfectly composed mugshot flashed across the screen, followed by footage of Richard being questioned by FBI agents. A knock at the door interrupted the broadcast. James entered with coffee and the morning paper. "Your keynote made the front page," he said, above Jessica's arrest. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "Mom, Dad's asking to see you. Says he needs to explain everything." "You don't owe him anything," James reminded her. But Sarah had questions that needed answers. She agreed to meet Richard at the hotel restaurant. He was already there when she arrived, looking older than his 65 years. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice hollow. "Why did you do it, Richard? We had everything. I got greedy. Jessica showed me how to manipulate investment accounts. By the time I realized how deep we were, it was too late." He stared into his coffee. "She planned everything, even our marriage." Sarah thought about her seniors, people like Mrs. Peterson, who trusted others with their life savings. How many people lost their retirement? Hundreds. Richard's hands shook. "Jessica handled the accounts. She made sure my signatures were on everything. When it started falling apart, she moved the money to her private accounts." The restaurant TV showed Jessica being led into court. Richard flinched at the image. "I deserved this," he said. "But watching you yesterday, seeing what you've built, how you're actually helping people, I realized what I threw away." Sarah's phone lit up with another call from the Department of Health and Human Services. They wanted to fast-track the national program funding. "Your program," Richard said quietly, "could it help people like me? Seniors who've lost everything?" Before Sarah could answer, Amanda appeared at their table. She had flown in that morning after watching the news. "I've been so angry at you," she told her father. "But Mom taught me something through all this. Bitterness doesn't help anyone." Richard broke down. "I'm sorry, to both of you. I destroyed our family for nothing." Carol called with updates from home. The library's website was crashing from all the traffic. Senior centers across the country wanted to implement the program. "The thing is, Richard," Sarah said, "this program exists because of what you did. Every senior we help, every scam we prevent. It all started the day you left me at that airport." James joined them, carrying printouts of Sarah's new federal grant. The funding would help expand the program to every state. "We're starting a special class," Sarah told Richard, "for seniors who've lost their savings to fraud, people who need to rebuild." "Like me," Richard whispered. "Yes," Sarah said. "Like you." Amanda touched her father's hand. "I'll help you get started, Dad. Mom's program, it's about second chances." That evening, Sarah walked on the beach with James. Her phone buzzed with news that Jessica had agreed to a plea deal implicating several others in the fraud scheme. "How do you feel?" James asked. Sarah watched the sunset over the Pacific. "Free," she said. "Finally free." Back at the hotel, she found a message from the conference organizers. They wanted her to lead a national task force on senior financial protection. "Mom?" Brian called. "I saw the news. Is it okay if I help Dad with the basic computer classes? He's going to need support." Sarah looked at the family photo on her phone, not the old one from her marriage, but a new one taken at Christmas. Her children, James, her senior students, all smiling together. "Yes," she told Brian. "That's what family does." Later, as she packed for her flight home, Sarah realized something. Forgiveness hadn't made her weak. It had made her stronger than revenge ever could. Spring arrived in Millbrook with news of Sarah and James's engagement. They planned a simple ceremony in the library's community room, surrounded by their senior students and family. "Nothing fancy," Sarah told Amanda while preparing for the ceremony. "Just the people who matter." The library's computer lab had doubled in size, funded by the federal grant. Every morning, seniors filled the seats, learning to protect themselves in the digital world. In the back row, Richard attended his third week of classes, guided patiently by Brian. "Dad's actually getting good at this," Brian told Sarah. "He's helping other seniors spot investment scams." The morning news reported Jessica's sentencing, 15 years for fraud. She had betrayed not only the seniors who trusted her, but also her accomplices. Richard had avoided prison by cooperating with authorities, though he now lived on Social Security in a small apartment. "Your father's making progress," Sarah told her children during their weekly family dinner. "He's volunteering with our fraud prevention team." Michael raised his glass. To Mom's program, now in 50 states. The wedding was everything Sarah wanted. Her senior students decorated the library with streamers and flowers. Carol played the piano. Mrs. Peterson, their first success story, signed the marriage certificate as a witness. "I never thought I'd find love again," Sarah said during her vows to James. "But sometimes life's worst moments lead us to our best." Richard sat quietly in the back, invited by their children. He watched as Sarah, radiant at 65, married the man who had helped her rebuild her life. After the ceremony, Richard approached the newlyweds. "Sarah, James, thank you for letting me be here, and for giving me a chance to make amends." That evening, during the reception, Sarah received a call from the White House. The president wanted to recognize her program at a special ceremony. They were naming her to lead a national commission on senior protection. "From abandoned wife to presidential appointee," Carol whispered. "Now that's a story." Summer brought more changes. The program expanded to include veterans and rural communities. Sarah traveled the country, training librarians and community leaders. James coordinated everything from their home base in Millbrook. "Mom," Amanda called one evening, "Dad helped prevent a major scam today. He recognized the warning signs from your class and alerted 20 seniors in his building." Sarah smiled at the irony. The man who had once betrayed her trust was now helping others protect theirs. During the Christmas gathering, their expanded family filled Sarah and James's new home. Michael's kids showed Richard how to video chat. Amanda shared news of her pregnancy. Brian announced he was starting a West Coast branch of the program. "Look at this," Carol said, showing Sarah the latest statistics. $10 million in prevented fraud this year alone. "You've changed so many lives." Sarah watched her family, old and new, related by blood and by choice. Her senior students had become family too, dropping by with cookies and success stories. "Remember that day at the airport?" James asked quietly, holding her hand. "Which one?" Sarah smiled. "The day I lost everything, or the day I realized I had everything?" Richard, overhearing, stepped forward. "Sarah, that day I left you, I thought I was heading toward happiness. I was wrong. You're the one who found it, by helping others." The evening ended with plans for the future. The program would expand internationally. Sarah would testify before Congress about senior protection. James would develop new teaching modules. As their guests left, Sarah stood in their doorway. 12 years ago, she'd been a broken woman in an airport terminal. Now she was a national leader, a new bride, a stronger mother, a trusted teacher. "Ready for tomorrow?" James asked, wrapping his arms around her. Sarah thought of her morning class, of the seniors waiting to learn, of the lives yet to be changed. "More than ready," she said. "This is just the beginning." In her office, a framed photo showed her with her first class of seniors. Beside it stood her Presidential Medal for Public Service. And there, on her desk, lay a small heart-shaped pin, a reminder of how far she'd come. Sometimes, Sarah had learned, life's greatest gifts come disguised as its deepest wounds. You just have to be brave enough to find the purpose in your pain. If you enjoyed Sarah's journey of resilience and triumph, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone turn their pain into purpose like Sarah did? Tell us your story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of transformation and justice. Remember, sometimes life's greatest storms lead us to our most beautiful rainbows. And as Sarah taught us, true happiness isn't about getting revenge. It's about building something beautiful from the pieces of your broken dreams.